So let's look at the frontal bone, which as we said is right over here. And there is like a notch over here, which I know it's very hard to see, but that notch is known as the supraorbital notch or supraorbital foramen. And if we look at the other image over here, you can actually see that notch. Okay, so that notch is the supra. So supra means above, orbital. So orbital refers to like this orbit over here, the orbit of the eye. So it's supra, it's above, supraorbital foramen or supraorbital notch in this case. Here you can actually see like a hole. So supraorbital foramen. If you see a hole, it's probably a foramen. If you just see a notch, then it could just be a supraorbital notch. We know that the zygomatic bone is paired, one here, one here. We also know that the maxilla is paired, one here and one here. The vertical nasal septum refers to this over here. So the vomer or vomer bone is also part of the vertical nasal septum, which is this vertical line going down over here. Now, when we look at an orbit is basically the hole, the big hole that you see. And so a question that might appear is what makes up the orbit? What bones form the orbit? So if we look over here in the orbit, and I'm just going to zoom in just slightly so you can see better. This orbit is made up of the frontal bone. It's made up of the zygomatic bone. It's made up of the maxilla bone. So all of the rim of the orbit, rather, so the rim or the outline of the orbit is made up of these three bones. Here's another picture of the skull. So I do encourage you to review the bones and the names of each bones. Let's look at sutures. So sutures is basically where two bones meet, okay? So it creates that line. And so there's the coronal suture, there's the lambdoid suture, and the squamosal suture. And what's important to know is where they are located. So if we look at the first one, this over here is known as the coronal suture. And when you think of the word coronal, think of like crown, think of like something high up. And it's the one right in the front, okay? So that suture over here is known as the coronal suture. The lambdoid suture is, if I turn this around, this over here is the lambdoid suture. This is also known as the parieto-occipital suture because the parietal bone is here and the occipital bone is here. And then we have the squamosal suture, which is this one right over here. And it's right by the temporal bone. Okay, so again, coronal suture, lambdoid suture, and squamosal suture. And since we're talking about sutures, I'm just going to let you know that this one over here is known as sagittal suture. So this one right running in the middle, sagittal suture. Let's go back to your PowerPoint. Now, when you look at the lateral view, which is the side view, do you see this bump over here? This bump is known as the mastoid process. So when I look at mass, I think of massive. And yes, it's not massive, but it is massive compared to like the bone right beside it. So mastoid process. A process is usually something that's sticking out. So you can see here's a projection that's sticking out. That is a process. There is this over here. This line over here is the zygomatic process. Okay, so something sticking out, zygomatic process. And then we have the styloid process, which is this little bone that's just sticking out over here. And a good tip to remember this is think of ST for stiletto heels. So it's a heel, right? Like a stiletto heel, think of that. Another way to look at it is stylo means pen in French. So you can think of it as a pen that's sticking out. So styloid process. So all of these words end in process, which means it's a projection, something, a bone is sticking out. So let's look at that. So if we look over here, this over here is a mastoid process. This over here is the styloid process. So it doesn't really look that pointy, but in another skull it might. So if I look at this one, let's see here. Mastoid process, styloid process, like the stylo pen or like the stiletto heels. And then this over here is the zygomatic process. So this makes up the temporal bone, but it's attaching itself to the zygomatic bone. So that's why it's called the zygomatic process. Okay, so mastoid, styloid process, zygomatic process. Now, when you look at the palate, what you will see is you'll see some interesting features. And so let's look at those features. So one of them is the incisive foramen. So incisive foramen is that hole that you're looking at. So that hole is the incisive foramen. So when dentists are trying to anesthetize or numb the area, and let's say they need to do work in this teeth, they'll numb around the foramen so that the teeth become numb. So to lose the feeling, they have to inject somewhere around the foramen or incisive foramen. There's a median palatine suture, and if I zoom in here, we can have a better look. So the median palatine suture, and I'm just trying to make it like this, okay, is this one right over here, okay? And I know this one, and then we have the transverse palatine suture. Okay, so median stands for middle palatine suture, and then transverse. And you can think of transverse has like a T, so this is like forming a T, that line makes a T, right? So transverse palatine suture. Now there are some more foramens to look at. There's the foramen, so some people call it ovale, some people pronounce it ovale, or ovale. There's so many different ways. So I'm going to call it foramen ovale, and that's right here. And again, you can see that there are blood vessels and nerves that get thread through these holes, that get thread through the foramens. There's the foramen spinosum, which is like this. When I think of spinosum, I think of spinach, and there's a reason why I'll say that. So later on, when we'll learn about the arteries, the reason there's a story that's associated with spinach, so I'll talk about that later when we get there. And then there's the Foramen Lacerum, which is this one right over here, okay? Just know for now that foramens are holes. So when we look at the inferior view of the skull, what we're looking at is when we turn the skull around, we're looking at the inferior view. So this is the inferior view, the view from below, okay? So inferior view. I take the skull and I look at it from this side. This is the inferior view. Now let's see. When we look at the inferior view, there are some interesting things we can see. We can see all the foramens that we looked at, and then this one is a huge foramen. It's called Foramen Magnum. And when I think of magnum, I think of massive, I think of, magnificent. There's so many words that you can think of, and so when you think of massive, you think of magnificent, think of huge. And so that big hole, this is where the brain stem kind of comes out from, is the foramen magnum.